And thank you for joining us. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm your host, Daniel Davis. Many of us, as we approach midlife, want to see certain changes that can occur that can help us move forward to be able to achieve the dreams that we have, if not just to maybe maintain a good lifestyle and move forward. But sometimes as we try to take those positive steps in the right direction, we always find somehow there's sort of a stop sign, a red light, or something unconsciously that we just don't know about that prevents us from doing that. Let's say, for instance, that you're deciding to change careers. You just go in, you get the job interview, but then all of a sudden you find you've got a particular attitude about the person who's interviewing you. Is it possible somewhere deep inside there's this little critic in there that's having you transfer some sort of a belief onto someone that you just met, that you don't know, that's preventing you from moving forward into a new career that can possibly change your entire life? We'd like to explore that today as we talk with two of our guests that are going to be talking with us about compassion, strength, and the inner critic, and how we can take this critic and hopefully use it in an advantage in such a way that can help us move forward in a very positive way. First off, I'd like to introduce our guest, Rod Burney. Doctor, he is a board-certified psychotherapist specializing in psychotherapy, meditation instruction, mind-body medicine, and spiritual guidance. And our second guest is Suzanne Nedler, and she's been working with the counselor and a group leader, blending body-focused psychology and spirituality for the past 18 years. They're going to be talking with us today about the inner critic and what we can do to change that. And I'd like to welcome both of our guests to the Beyond 50 radio program, Dr. Rod Burney and Suzanne Nadler. And thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today.
Thank you for having us. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes. We enjoyed your intro. It's so true. It's true.
Well, you know, this to me seems to be even a demon, even as a radio show host, that even I deal with. You know, each day I say, you know, tomorrow's going to be a different day, but then I sometimes find myself doing the same things over and over. It's really like Groundhog Day. And I know there are a lot of people out there that can identify with that. And it's like, what do we do to break that circle? You know, how do we move forward? What's the first step?
Well, I think one of the first step is awareness.
Sure.
And it's even becoming aware that this is what's behind the problem. We sort of have a flow sheet that goes against a bunch of symptoms, you know, that as a psychiatrist I see in many people all the time. But if there's confusion, numbness, indecision, deadening, agitation, anxiety, they can come from lots of different things, but we always want to consider, is there an inner critic, or instead of that classical terminology, is there a superego, an over-I, this sort of internalized authority figure that's sort of ruling and dominating us and really doesn't let us get in touch with sort of the core of our being and our dynamic unfoldment. So for me, the first part is, does that exist, or can I hold that as a possibility? And it's interesting, when we started this work, you know, I'd read all about the superego, but nobody ever really taught me a sort of an active, accurate way to recognize the inner critic or judging mind, and then to challenge or disengage. So I decided I didn't have much of one, and then after meditating for years, I began to discover that, in fact, that was in the background a lot. So one of the things we talk about is how at first it's often undifferentiated. We don't really hear the voice. We just sort of have these nebulous, confused, dead and frozen feelings. And that's the first thing that we teach is meditation. Really to sit, to sense in, to breathe in 4 relaxed breaths into the belly center. You know, in martial arts, that's the hara center, so that we can ground in there. And as we're present with ourselves, oftentimes those undifferentiated states calm, or we then begin to hear that voice which is dictating and telling us what to do and is criticizing us.
Sometimes it's actually easier to hear how we project that voice out onto others. Like in your example about the interview, a lot of the times, rather than hearing our own inner critic, we'll hear what it is that we think the other person is saying to us, which is, of course, being somewhat misconstrued through our own thoughts. And this can often be seen as that other person is really criticizing me. So the dilemma about finding the inner critic is that you first have to recognize that it's true that people on the outside do criticize us, but that's not what's causing most of us to stay stuck. Mm-hmm. It's usually because it's going on inside all the time, that we can't make that progress like you're talking about, that we keep ourselves in the Groundhog Day picture. Mm-hmm. so actually it can be very useful to begin to see also what you're projecting out onto others, how you feel you're being criticized for what you're saying or what you're doing, or we notice it all the time with friends. We're looking for their approval or attention, and so we're very tuned in whether or not we've said the right thing. And a lot of that is our own internal inner critic.
So there we have sort of...
I was going to say something real quick on that, Suzanne, if I may, and that is when you talk about, for instance, that we're always looking for approval. Now, that goes way back to when we were born.
That's right.
And it seems that as we approach midlife, there's this weird little awakening that happens that says, I've had enough. I just don't feel that going in this direction continually is going to make me happy. So I'm going to start basically establishing my own boundaries and saying, this is who I want to be, whether somebody likes it or not. But yet that really doesn't change. I mean, when you think of the patterning up until that point, you've been doing this for years and you think you're just going to erase it, overnight and change, but then you feel like nothing has changed. I can see why a person would feel stuck.
Yes, exactly, because there is actually this, what you're describing is a conflict inside of us between the, you could say the younger part that we recognize as like the child. You said it goes way back. And so there is a child part in all of us that has this desire and need for approval and would like attention. And then there's the conflict with the part of us that says, well, you shouldn't be doing that. You should be grown up by now. That's the inner critic. And so you've got the inner parent telling us where we should be by now. And you've got the child who still has some of the same wants and desires going on. And so there's got to be a way that inner conversation shifts, because otherwise that inner conversation keeps us just basically either stuck in the child wanting approval and attention all the time, or saying, no, you can't do that. You should get out of this. You should be better by now.
Mm-hmm. So that sort of slow, progressive, organic growth doesn't happen. One of the things that I've learned over the years is that change doesn't happen by trying to become different than who I am, but by really deeply experiencing who I am. Then this sort of natural growth unfolds. So the first part of change would be recognizing I have an inner dialogue going on. Who's talking to whom? And you realize that core need for approval is really the foundation bedrock of the whole personality structure. I want to be seen. I want to be approved. I want to be mirrored. And as a child and infant, if I do these things, I get positive comments. If I do these things, I get negative comments. And all those impressions over the years form that inner critic that says, if I go outside this box, I'm going to be criticized. If I stay in this box, I'm going to be liked. Even though in midlife we now see the change, there's been 20, 30, 40 years of this, and the situation has changed. I'm now an adult in my life, although I'm still operating on that old tape, on that old conversation.
So it sounds to me then what's really important for us to be able to move forward, at least one of the first things anyway, is to be aware of that inner critic, and that usually comes from not only just a thought, but that there's also a feeling somewhere within the body that's involved as well, and to move in and sit with that. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, and when we look at the experience of the self, which can include the adult and that child self, there's always a pattern of sensations and behaviors that come with it, as well as feelings and as well as thoughts, concepts, and beliefs. So there's sort of the varieties of sensations, feelings, and thoughts. So we want to be aware of all that, and that's where meditation, and we're not doing it in terms of some spiritual school or religious belief, but this quality of awareness where I sit, I sense into the belly center, I breathe in for a slow count of 4, I breathe out, and I'm not trying to go to some blank state of mind, because Westerners, when we meditate, we usually get in touch with the unconscious inner dialogue and feelings and sensations, but I'm doing that to see what is happening inside. So if I'm having a hard time moving towards that job change or I'm being ambivalent, what if I take a moment to slow down and sit with that and sort of see what are the sensations, what are the feelings, what are the thoughts, what's the dialogue? Because then as I become aware of the dialogue, I should be doing this, I shouldn't, if you do this, you'll lose approval, then there's even more of an opportunity for change. But again, the first step is really awareness, and sometimes when people sit in my office and they simply become aware of that dialogue and the reality of it, sometimes people just crack up and break up into laughter.
Mm-hmm.
because they see something which is so childish and old, and they never really paid attention. When they do, they find it actually sometimes quite funny because they actually hear the way their minds are talking exactly the way they did when they were 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years old.
Mm-hmm. So tell me, Jen, just so our listening audience can be aware of what we're talking about here, what is this counseling style that the two of you have as an approach versus the traditional therapy style that most people are aware of?
Well, part of it is that we really bring in the whole body, the whole self. And so we actually ask people to become aware of the sensations that are arising in their body, to become aware of the feelings and the thoughts, the memories, the ideas, all of it. Because most of the time, what I would say happens in traditional therapy is that a person comes in and they talk. And everything that they've said are pretty much all old tapes that they've probably gone over many, many times. Sometimes it brings up certain feelings, but it isn't necessarily anything that's allowed to just arise and become new in this moment. So when you become aware in your body of what's actually going on, it brings you back into the present moment. And it also allows for the newness of what is actually happening right now to occur. And in order to be in the world, we got to do that as well. We've got to be able to bring that sense of the newness of things arising, as opposed to just operating on our old tapes. So that's one big thing that I'd say that we do. But the second one is that it's about allowing whatever it is that arises. And, it sounds so easy, but it is not.
I can believe that, because if it was, everybody would be changing on a regular basis.
That's true. We would just be softening, and it's, most of us, we don't think about it, but it's really about holding tension in our bodies that keeps us in old patterns. And if you sense into your body, you can usually find certain areas that you always hold tension in. And when you allow, that means that whatever you bring awareness into, whatever it is that's arising, whether it's a thought or it's a feeling or it's a sensation, and then you immediately begin to see your relationship to that. Is that okay to allow anger when it arises? Or, oh my God, is it going to get me into trouble? Or is it okay to feel this pain in my belly, or does it make me begin to feel afraid that means there's something bad happening? So these simple little things that are just like there all the time, we become afraid of them, or we push away and avoid them.
And I'd like to add to that when I've been in therapy, I was always kind of wondering, what do I do when I go home? A lot of times the therapist can be very sort of blank and impassive. We're very active and engaged, and I really wanted to know how to work my process. One of the core things that we learn to do when we're infants is to self-regulate, to learn to feed ourselves, to make sure we're the right temperature, the right clothes on, off. But no one teaches us emotional self-regulation. So we teach a very clear set of skills for people to learn and practice in sessions and in between sessions, so they can recognize the inner critic, so they can take active steps to disengage, so they can recognize that's that allowing the child's self, those old patterns that are arising, and then active ways to sort of see, to reflect, to hold that. So they're actually practical exercises, practical techniques of self-regulation that we teach. And I think that's very different, because the cognitive behaviorals do that, but there's no real depth of understanding. And usually the more analytically oriented therapists aren't teaching active things to do in between sessions. So we try to bridge that gap, because you need tools. You need tools to work on your car. You need tools to work on yourself, too.
Now, as people have approached and come into your courses and they've come to you, what sort of common things do you see? It's, not everybody's the same all the time, but what sort of common things do people come to you with, and how have you been able to effectively help them change the direction as they wish to?
Well, I'd say one common thing is people come in and they can be, there's often a sense of anxiety or dissatisfaction or chronic low-level depression or some of the sort of core things. And there's a core pattern of when I teach people how to work their process, all of a sudden there's a possibility for them to be an adult human being living a real life. If I don't know how to do that, if I don't know how to work my process, and no one teaches me that, again, it's like going out to your car and no one teaches you how to rebuild the engine or how to work on it. You don't know how to do it, so you don't do it. So I find there's sort of that identification most people have unknown with the child self, and there's sort of a hidden dependency. And as they become aware of how to work their process, there's this wonderful sense of agency, of accomplishment that begins to develop.
Because I know, honestly, sometimes I like to air out some of my situations here on the radio program, but it's also so that I could reach and let the audience know, hey, even as radio show hosts, we're not perfect.
Yeah.
But, one of the biggest challenges I've always seen in my life are there are things that I want to do, but I don't plan for the most part. And the other thing is that I tend to procrastinate a lot. Now, what would you say would be the underlying thing with that causes a person to mainly be stuck like that where, I'll just go ahead and I'll do that tomorrow, but it doesn't get done. And then there's the anxiety that it doesn't get done. And then you realize, well, I really feel stuck in my life. What do I do from here? And, you really want to do something, but it's like this wall just says, no, you're going to stay right back there and just stay frustrated. What would you say to something like that?
Well, it's definitely you're describing an inner dialogue that's going on. Procrastination.
Oh, big time.
Yeah,
God, it's like a game show after a while,
Exactly.
and then just each day, tomorrow's going to be a new day, I'll do it then. Or, I plan to start next week to do this, but then there's no real writing down of anything, no plans. It even sometimes frustrates my wife, like, you don't plan to do anything, you're too spontaneous, but then you just feel like you're going nowhere. So.
Pretty much the ultimate game show.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
The $10,000 pyramid without ever reaching the pyramid or the top, much less. So.
Yeah, and it's frustrating for you too, but that it's hard because that procrastination, and it's so funny. A lot of our words in the English language take us away from the actual feeling tone, and that's what procrastination is a word like that, because underneath procrastination there's just an energy that is anger. I'm not getting to this. I'm putting myself off.
And on a certain level, it starts externally with the child. It's called the command-resist cycle. When we're little, there are all these things we need to do. And a very common American cycle is the child is bombarded with all these things they need to do, although now with a lot of latchkey kids that doesn't happen, which creates another problem. But especially in our generation, we were commanded to do things, and then the child can either sort of go along in what we term as docile obedience, like a robot, or they can rebel, when we get into adolescence, or they can say, I'm going to do it later. So it's a really resistance to an authority figure, to an internal authority figure in our childhood. Now, if our parents are on it, they set warm, firm limits, they follow through, they let us have that frustration, and we learn, I need to do some things. But that command resist then happens internally. When I tell myself, time to study, that child part of me comes up. That part that's telling me what to do becomes the inner critic, and then the child part rebels against that and puts it off. So you're really then internalizing that old conflict in your family of origin with your parents. You're now playing that out all by yourself.
Interesting.
Only now you get to play it out with your wife a little bit.
In
other words, and that's
but honestly too, and I'm sure for any of our listeners out there who have had this experience, there's a tremendous amount of frustration. There is pain because you know and you feel that you should be in a different place, but you just don't feel yourself getting there.
Right, but then you can see the inner critic on top of it, because now not only is there this difficult psychodynamic going on inside, but now your inner critic is telling me you should be over this, and you should be over this yesterday. So then there's no space or room to go, what's going on here? Who's talking to whom? And then we're back to what Susanna was talking about earlier. There's no room to sort of allow that, to see what is happening inside, to pick apart, to sort out, oh, there's the part that's saying I should do this. Oh, here's this part that's saying no and digging in his heels. Oh, that's just like with my mom and dad as a child. But when we say I should be over this, that's the inner critic.
Okay, so now that we've got that established, what tools do you help people implement so that they can begin to work with this and move forward?
Well, it depends upon where the point of resistance is. It really does.
Are you saying this gets more complicated?
Yes, when you individualize it. In other words, you gave us a very individual story.
Maybe we should just work with the individual example.
That would probably be easier to do than to just, we can tell you all the tools, but the truth of it is that in that moment of working with someone, you really have to be attuned to where's the stuck point.
So the first stuck point for him would be in his judgment. You're saying, I should be over this, right?
Right.
Part of you saying, you shouldn't have to deal with this. So that's the inner critic. So in a way, we teach people to externalize that, to put it on, get two pillows. We'd have three. One for you, one for the inner critic, one for the child self. So you're there and you're struggling, right? And all of a sudden you hear this voice inside your head saying, you should be over this. You should just be able to do it. So I'd have you go over to that pillow and address yourself and say, you should be over this right now. Then I'd ask you, how does that make you feel if someone was following you around all day long telling you should be over everything? And you'd probably either collapse or get angry or whatever. But what you don't do is you don't stand up to that part, because as kids we couldn't really stand up to our parents. And I would say to that part 3 times, I'm getting over this on my time frame, not yours. Get off my back. And that's called a superego defend, where we're actively defending. And then you sense in, and oftentimes after people do that, and it's not about arguing or this, it's about disengaging from that. So when I speak up the way I couldn't as a kid, even though I think I'm in my adult place, oftentimes as someone senses in afterwards, they become aware of more or new possibilities open up. So that would be one, and then depending on what's underneath that, then you could address, the child part with what we call an empathic statement, where you might say, you feel really frustrated and overwhelmed right now. So you just address that child part really. Or right now you're digging in your heels, because you're afraid if you do that, you'll lose your sense of self. Or you're digging in your heels because that's the only way you have a sense of power. So I'd say that to that other pillow, which is the child self. So we're teaching people to recognize these internal parts of themselves and then to either stand up to a critical thought or to be empathic. And that doesn't mean problem solving or being mushy-gushy. It means really sort of recognizing that part. And that recognition, as we see ourselves clearly, that's where that sort of organic change begins to happen.
So
go ahead.
So basically, wherever a person is stuck in believing who they are, which is some people get stuck in that I'm the child and this is all these things are happening to me. Like when you described the frustrated state, that's what it feels like on on our child level. We feel really frustrated when we can't get what we want, things aren't working out. But if we feel identified in that area, then what we try to do is actually move a person into the adult identity. That's basically what we're doing, but we do it with teaching very specific skills, because otherwise there's nowhere to move if you're the child.
So when we put out those 3 pillows, you see, then you begin to separate yourself, and people are like, well, I don't want to go over there. And it's like, well, you want to stay with your child? So they separate the child out. We take what's happening inside our heads and we put it outside of ourselves so we can separate myself from the critic. A lot of people think we are our critics. I can separate myself from my child. A lot of people think we are our inner child. We're not even aware of this. But then that 3rd pillow becomes the curious one. Who is this if I'm not the inner critic or the child, if I'm not the internalized parent or child of the past? Who am I? I'm this part that observes, that witnesses. I'm like the sky, and these things are clouds floating through it.
Now, your workshop is compassion, strength, and the inner critic. Now, this was something that caught our attention because you're teaching people skills to work with their personality. Let's talk about these qualities of compassion and strength and how they fit into the modality that we're discussing here.
Great. So when you learn how to stand up to the inner critic, when you can say, back off, you're not pushing me, I'm taking my own time, right? Like we described with you, if that was, if some inner critic was saying, you should be farther along. So when you learn to stand up and say that to yourself, much less to anybody else, that actually develops a quality of strength. Because when we are, you can see that the effect of that criticism, it either makes us overreactive, or it makes us collapse, or it makes us hide in our heads. Those are the 3 main things that happen. And when we can just stand up to it and disengage from it, that is the true element of strength.
And so real strength, most people have false strength, which I'm going to be angry and yell and scream, or I'm going to have a war and blow up someone else. That's false strength. Real strength is a sense of, in the body, you experience a sense of solidity, of groundedness, and yet there's a precision, there's a clarity, there's a discernment. there's a capacity to see clearly and take appropriate action. So there's a fluidity to real strength, as opposed to this sort of rigid muscle tensed up that we sort of see, in all the, Rambo movies and things like that. That's an aspect of false strength. And it's actually a quality of consciousness of our true nature that you begin to experience. In certain subtle schools, it's called the red latif, or the red energy, and it's this quality of consciousness is thought of as a white light. There are different flavors that is these different colors in the rainbow, and strength is it can be felt as a red energy. You're solid like a tree, and yet like a tree, there's a sense of flexibility. You can move in the wind some. So that's that quality of strength, and it's your right to defend, your right to exist the way you are.
Yeah, Rod, I want to touch on something that you just said there that I think is really vitally important when you talk about how with this if we can't separate it outside of ourselves, so that with compassion and strength we can begin to quiet our minds and see a true result or outcome. That's really interesting, because sometimes we come up with solutions to our problems that really make things probably worse, whereas moving in and sitting in with this and feeling it, then you become, even in a meditative state, just waiting and becoming aware and allowing an answer to come in. And that's kind of what we're doing, is slowing things down?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I would say slowing down is, when you look at our whole culture, it's so fast. So we're slowing down so we can actually see what's going on. It's like most of us are in a car that's going at 120 miles an hour, so a rose garden is a blur. Our external world is a blur, our internal. So that's one of the things that meditation and awareness does. We slow down, and then we begin to actually see the truth and the reality of what's happening inside us and how that's impacting the world outside.
Mm-hmm. Just such fascinating stuff to think that we can be so messed up sometimes, even though we seem normal on the outside.
Yeah, it's just like we're not taking it all in. I think of it more like that. It's kind of like we have our vision is very narrow of ourselves and of the world. And so it's like really part of what we're doing is we're trying to broaden that vision. And in terms of compassion, the way that the compassion piece comes in is that most of us, it's almost impossible to have really been recognized and seen for all of who we are by our parents. So we have a lack, and that's what brings that sense of wanting more, of wanting approval. So when we approve and recognize ourselves, and that's another piece that we teach people, how to make an empathic statement, like Rod talked about with you, recognizing maybe the frustration that's present, or recognizing the procrastination without judging, then that it brings this beautiful quality of compassion, of really understanding oneself.
Mm-hmm. And compassion comes from compati, which is the roots to be with. It's the capacity to be present with ourselves, especially in our suffering, rather than being reactive, rather than attacking or blaming someone else or collapsing, like Susanna talked about that. And it's almost like a soothing menthol salve that flows through the body. It's referred to as a green light of consciousness. And it really allows us to relax and just be present with ourselves, because it's so difficult to be present with our suffering. And I just wanted to make one comment when you said it's hard when we see how we can be sort of messed up inside. We also don't recognize and experience the depth and the majesty and the mystery of our beings and what precious human beings each one of us is. We miss that too.
Well, it seems this day and age, too, and this has probably been going on for centuries when it comes to the human condition, is that we tend to compare ourselves with the Joneses. And it was just the other day I was talking with a friend of mine how, you have these chronological ways of looking at life, especially here in America, where by certain ages you should have certain things going on in your life, otherwise you're possibly a failure. Now, there's a big huge critic right there, and we agreed on that part, but it's like what to do with it. So let's just say that you want and you desire these things, whether it's a nice home or a great family, to do world travel, but for some reason, financially, you just can't seem to get it together one way or the other. You try to save money, but then something happens, and then that goes away, And it seems to go on, and it's trying to break those cycles so you can move into a life that I think you truly desire. But I would think that in following your example of especially sitting in with this critic, with the compassion and the strength to say, let's clear this away, this is what's going on, that true answers can actually lead you into directions that, as you were saying earlier, Rod, it unravels a mystery and a path that takes you in directions you could have never imagined, while at the same time fulfilling those deep-seated goals and dreams that you've always had.
Mhm. Yes, it's true.
Is that what you've seen happen as you've worked with people?
Yes, definitely. And it's really about, you first have to accept and allow where you are now. So in the example you were giving about that you have these dreams and these desires and where you want your life to be and how you want your family to be, and when you can settle in after really bringing your awareness to how is the superego involved in this, how is the inner critic involved, how is it that I feel connected into my child self, which might feel like I don't deserve it or that I'm never going to get it or whatever it is that, my child felt, that once we allow those pieces to really sink in and we can really just accept this is where we're at right now, then change actually just automatically happens. It's the resistance and the holding to how we believe the world is that actually keeps us from being able to change or just flow to the next piece.
And that's really one of the way the inner critic works is we have all these concepts of who we're supposed to be, some from our families of origin, a lot, as you were talking about, from our culture.
Right.
At 40 or 50, this is why midlife is such an amazing time, because that's when the stuff really hits the fan, because I had all these concepts about who I was supposed to be that I learned from my culture through advertising and whatever.
But there's the way I want to be, but then it seems like I'm running out of time and it'll never happen.
And it'll never happen. And that's where it's important to say to the inner critic, my life is good enough for me, or what's happening is what's happening, get off my back. Or you say to that other part, it's sad that dream of traveling to Europe is not going to happen this year. Or it's sad you feel so much grief that home you dreamed of and you thought was so important isn't going to happen in that way. As we grieve that, then we settle into the reality of who I am, and it's like we open our eyes, and it's like, maybe I see what's really possible. And, the studies have been done. There's a book, Your Money or Your Life, in the 70s. That,
yeah, I'm very familiar. Very good book.
Yeah, beautiful book. And as income went up, the quality of life went up a tiny, you've got to get food, clothing, and shelter. Once you get food, clothing, and shelter, if you're making, $10,000 or $5,000 to do that, or $50,000 or $100,000, the quality of life satisfaction went up minimally. And then I think it was about 100 or 120 back in the 70s. Actually, the quality of life started to deteriorate, the life satisfaction one. So sometimes as we settle into who we are, we realize, maybe my soul's calling, not to be this big manager in the plant, but to have a daycare or care for kids or being more involved with my family and friends. There may be soft, relationally oriented ways that come that added richness to life that we can't imagine. Most chief CEOs, when they are, on their deathbed, they don't wish they'd made another million. They wish they'd
had more life.
Right. They wish they'd had more life, that they'd gone for a walk with their grandson, that they'd watched a sunset, that they'd read a book by a fire, that they'd been with their loved ones, that they'd cooked a meal at the family thing. That's what we want, is that connectedness. And that's what we can drop into when we stop chasing these cultural illusions and fantasies, which right now, with the changes happening in this country, I think a lot of us are going to be having to let go of a lot of concepts of who we thought we were going to be and what we were going to be doing.
Now, why do you think that is, Rod?
Well, there's an economic contraction, and we don't know. Is that economic contraction? We just saw a beautiful movie at the Shakespeare Festival, a play last night, Paradise Lost, based on the Depression and the loss of upward mobility. We don't know what's going to happen. But as that's lost, there are many, many countries over the world who have a very low standard of living, who have a high life satisfaction index. And so we don't know what will happen, if there's going to be a long-term structural change in terms of income. Great Depression, everybody's income dropped 35%.
Right.
So that would mean we'd have to scale back some of those materialistic dreams and reconnect with community and soul.
Now, it's interesting because when we talk about the inner critic now, here's two big things that our listening audience should really know about, is that sometimes that also happens outside of us, and that's through projection and transference. And a very interesting story years ago when I was first beginning to pursue radio, much later than I guess I expected to, but I was like, it's time to do this. This is something you always wanted to do. And I boldly, even though I had fear in my stomach, went to a radio station. I walked in, and I just wanted to talk with somebody about the possibility. It just so happened there was a sales manager and the station manager as well. Just happened to be right there in the office, and they were talking. And so I told them why I was there, and they said, well, you know, you have a great radio voice, and you really should do this. Why don't you go ahead and give us a resume, you know, and so forth. And I was like, wow, this is so much different than I thought it was. And seriously, this is what I had imagined. And I actually said this. I somehow pictured barbed wire and sentries posted with guns.
Oh.
And it was just amazing why I would think about a dream that I had that would have something, you know, that element of fear to even go and pursue it, but why I would transfer something like a high security thing. And I think maybe that came back to the days when I used to go in grade school being, say, labeled with ADHD back in the 70s, is that I was disruptive in class, but I was usually always trying to be funny and entertaining, but I would always be punished. And in fact, it was so severe that what they would do, it would be 9 o'clock in the morning, send me to the nurse's office, and I had to stay in that bed until 3:30.
Oh, my goodness.
In the afternoon.
Sorry.
And this happened sometimes day after day. So I used to go to school in fear that I would do one little thing, boom, and then I would end up in that office. And it actually got to the point, I've talked with my wife about this, and so in the third and fourth grade mostly is where I seen myself going to school for half days just because they felt that they couldn't maintain me. But I was like, I didn't feel I was that bad of a kid. But I sometimes wonder if those were those deep-seated things that have caused me to just hold myself back so much, where there's a deep inside of me, like a dragon saying, no, you need to bust out because the people are demanding that from you, but you still hold it back. And I wonder if that's part of the procrastination I was talking about earlier. How would you address something like that? I can't believe it. Therapists who are quiet.
Well, that's I mean, I'd love to sit down and, you know, take 45 minutes and, go for
I understand.
a couple of months and start. But I think you're seeing, the first is to be aware. You're seeing there's that child self who wants to express himself, who has all this beautiful creative energy. You know, a lot of kids with ADD and ADHD are very bright, and yet it's too disruptive to the other. So you're bringing this impressions inside of another who's controlling, who's rejecting, who's making you sit in this bed, and then your core self-image begins to be, I'm bad, there's something wrong with me. So then you overlay that on the radio station. They're the nurse or the school, and you're the little boy. You don't even know you're consciously doing this, but there's this fear that you can't understand, which is so out of proportion to that. So just talking about it and bringing it into awareness is a part. We sort of have a 6-step transference exercise to look at old patterns and work with it, which if we were on a Skype session with audio-visual, we might be able to show it, but just by words alone, I think that will be difficult. But I might say to that child self, I might put him on the pillow and say, you know, you're scared to go to the radio station because you think something bad's going to happen, just like in school. And I'd say that 3 times to the child self, then I'd take a sigh. And that might allow, that recognition, that empathy might allow something to soften or dissolve. Now, you might need to say that a lot, you know. We used to have a saying, you know, an inner critic defend a day, you know, keeps the psychiatrist away, you know, meaning that real work happens a little bit at a time. So if you did one defend or one empathic statement a day over the course of a year, I think you might find your life changing.
And you can see that for you, that part of what happened is your life did change because you were willing to undergo that, the fear, and confront it. And in some ways, you could say that what you did was a inner critic defend. You were standing up to the inner critic and saying, I'm going here anyway. No matter what happens, I'm going to do it. So there was a way that you were really aligning with this powerful, creative aspect of yourself. And that's exactly actually what we try to get people to do when we work with them. So you did it naturally. Not all people can do it naturally. Some people get stuck, you know, and they just can't do it.
It's more of a matter of doing it consistently, though, and not waiting too long.
And my guess is you show up at the radio station every day, so with each passing day it gets easier and more delightful. But sometimes we'll structure an exercise where there's an old pattern like that the person enacts, and then we'll have a pause, and then they'll reenact it differently so they can open up to a new potential or a new possibility. And then if they need to defend against the inner critic or make an empathic statement to support them in that process, then they can do that in that. But it's that sort of doing the old dance, because there's that saying, you know, it's better I think it's the better the hell that I know than the heaven I don't.
Mm-hmm.
So if I have something old, it's familiar even if it's painful, and it's scary to move into that new possibility. And again, with what Susanna talked about earlier, you really contained, you allowed that fear. You sort of moved through it, and that child self was that energy of fear. You held it, you contained it, and you did it anyway.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think that was a very powerful action and a very healing moment in your life that was of profound significance for you.
Absolutely. Like I said, it was just amazing to say, I expected barbed wire and guns,
Yeah.
Why would I even see something like that,
Because of all those
But it is amazing, don't you agree, that with people that you've worked with over the years, that you see what seems to be ridiculous beliefs or projections, and you go, but they're very, very real to these people, and it's just amazing.
And having worked with mine, I always treat theirs with respect, because I know when I couldn't see them how real they felt and seemed. But then in retrospect, 6 months or years later, I could see that's not. It's just a concept or an old belief, but it has such power over us.
So one of the things that happens when, in this case, it's probably transference that you're describing, but you could still take it as a way to own a projection. This is the other piece that we do. When you see barbed wire and fences out there, like something is really stopping you, right, and it's prickly, what would happen if you let yourself feel that you were the barbed wire, you were the fence, and you're prickly, and you're going to stop anything that comes too close to you? See, that would be owning the projection and seeing what that's like for you to take on this this aspect of yourself that it seems like you're more comfortable and see more as being on the outside. And that's part of how we actually help a person to grow, to accept more aspects of themselves that usually they will place on others. That's why we tend to be very irritated at other people in the world. It's because it's usually there's these aspects of ourselves that we don't want to admit to. And so we project them out onto others. That's what projection is it's really an unconscious experience of trying to avoid something within ourselves. And so we see it in the other as being really magnified.
Now, I'm wondering, Susanna, as you bring the ideal up of the mirror, it sounds like, as somebody comes along and irritates you in a particular way, and you say, there's an aspect of myself that I don't want to see, and so move into, okay, first, what am I feeling? What is this person doing that makes me feel the way that I do? That as you begin to be in that feeling, then you begin to, I guess, meditate into this feeling. And I don't know how your particular steps or exercise work, but I'm taking a shot here. As you meditate into that, then you allow the reality of what you're transferring onto this person to reflect back to you who you are. Does that begin to cleanse that element of yourself as you say, well, that's how I am too, where you begin to smile and then that feeling just kind of eventually goes away, and so as it pops up again, it gets a little easier and a little easier to the point where you begin to see people for who they really are rather than who you think they are through you. I guess is the best way I could put it.
Yeah, I think it's best encapsulated with that, with like the bumper stickers that say something like, I hate people who hate people. In other words, because part of what you're seeing is that it's exactly what you're saying is that if you can begin to recognize that let's say what you're always picking out is all the people who are hateful, they're always expressing their hate. And so a part of me doesn't want to own my own hatred. And when I can actually become okay with the fact that, I'm human, it's all part of the human experience, to be hateful, to procrastinate, to be unpleasant at times, irritating, all these things, right, that we project out onto others, that when we can own them, just like you're saying, oh, yeah, I feel really hateful at times. Matter of fact, I hate people who hate people. It's like then it's like it actually becomes this humorous piece of recognizing, oh, this is just another aspect of being human.
And one of the reasons we teach the defending against the inner critic first is when you own those parts, you may have a judgment on you. So you then can defend, I'm human and I'm hateful at times, so get off my back. You have to be able to make space. We project to avoid criticism, so when you start to own projections, you may criticize yourself. The second thing I'd like to add is we don't just externalize negative parts of ourselves or project onto others. We do it with positive parts of ourselves. And I find it a very powerful exercise when people think about someone they really admire or idealize, and that person is so kind and benevolent. Well, then I would own that. I'm kind and benevolent. Mm-hmm. I'd say that 3 times, and then I'd sense in and see if I could come up with specific examples of ways that I have been kind or benevolent. So I see the positive things also in myself that I may not be able to own for various reasons from our conditioning.
Now, you integrate psychology and spirituality, and that's something we've been seeing really occur more and more in the last 20 years. Is it finally that psychology recognizes, well, the mind is just the hardwire of the soul?
Well, I'd like to come back to the word psychology and the word psyche. Okay. The word psyche translates as soul. So what we've done, most spiritual and religious traditions had a psychology in it, but we've artificially separated in the past 200 years psychology from spirituality. It's all about soul and depths of being. It's like what Susanna talked about earlier. We narrow down who we are. I mean, William James in the Varieties of Religious Experience was doing that in the 1800s. And Freud's parents were most likely Kabbalists, and so he took mysticism and spirituality, but he separated it out to try to make it scientific. So there's a depth, there's a mystery, there's subtler levels of our beings which contemporary psychology splits off. Now, what we find is in a lot of spiritual schools, they denigrate or diminish psychology, which you get into another kind of problem when you do that. But we have hearts, we have bodies, we have minds, and we have a subtle energetic field of consciousness. And if we don't recognize that, then we always will be impoverished. So the reason they're being integrated in is it's a call of the human soul and of the heart to be all of who we are.
I know that when you talk about earlier meditation as a means to recognize and integrate in the personality rather than to transcend it, you realize I just was reading not too long ago, it was a book called A Course in Happiness, and he talked somewhat at length about the integration of these things. Why is that important?
The integration of meditation and psychology?
Well, no, using meditation to recognize and integrate those elements, whether they're the positive or the negative aspects of your inner critic, to be able to integrate that into who your personality is, I think in such a way that you don't feel like there's something wrong or that you're broken or you're less than or you're more than or whatever the case may be, why integration is so important within this process.
Well, if you don't integrate, then part of you has been rejected.
Okay.
And you'll always be putting yourself down, and you'll never feel whole or complete.
Mm-hmm.
It's the whole idea that one of the hadiths of Muhammad was so beautiful. What he said that God revealed to him was, God said, I was a hidden treasure longing to be known. And so if you see that really all of us, that's what we are. We're this hidden treasure. What we want is to be known. We want to know all of ourselves. We can feel what it feels like to just live from a teeny tiny part of our lives. That's what you spoke about, like when we get into that Groundhog Day, and one part just keeps playing out. But to know all aspects of who we are, things that we think are bad, actually can end up giving us amazing. I don't know. I feel so much more human at times when I could just admit that I'm angry about something or that something is really frustrating to me. It's just like I'm part of the gang. And so that allowance of all those qualities of me opens up more information for me. It gives me more insight to the larger aspect of this soul being of who I am.
I think the Jungian analyst, Jean Shinoda Bolen, said we're spiritual beings on a human path.
Mm-hmm.
So we can transcend, but we're not here to transcend and be angels. When we die, that'll happen or not.
Right.
But we're here to bring those divine energies, to bring the fullness of experience of life here in manifestation. Because without the human form, then it's just pure spirit. There's no possibility.
I'm also reminded of something too, Rod. One of my favorite philosophers, the late Alan Watts. And I remember watching a videotape of him he was meditating and he was speaking at the same time, and he simply says, "We are the universe becoming consciously aware of ourselves."
Yeah.
That would be what Yaya said in very contemporary terms. Beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so if we split off something, then a piece of the universe has been left out.
Mm-hmm.
But if we can accept it in without judgment, right, without attacking ourselves. When we look at Buddhist psychology, the three cores, you'll see, we'll integrate in spiritual teachings and psychological teachings from all the traditions, but it's desire, aversion, and ignorance. So if I shouldn't be that, then there's aversion. I'm pushing something away. Or if I'm grasping onto this, then there's desire. And again, I can't just really be who I am. I'm always being pulled off center. And ignorance, when we have wisdom, when we recognize the fullness, then ignorance vanishes. So yeah, I want to be the whole universe manifesting itself. And that's where the root of most of the sacred words for God in the Islamic tradition is Allah. In the Christian tradition, Christ would have said Allah. So, the world is arguing over a syllable here. But it means divine unity. It means I'm holding everything that's unfolding in the moment. That's what God is. It's this entire unfoldment of my being, inside and outside. But if anything's split off, something's missing from the whole.
So you can see how right living, if you will, becomes very difficult, especially as we talked earlier in the program, with a society that conditions us to believe this is who we are, how we should be, how we should look, how we should feel, how we should deal with certain circumstances and situations. And you kind of wonder about our today's youth with the cell phones and the bombardment of everything that's going on, whether they'll have any identity at all or how hard it will be to get to that place.
Mhm. Yeah, you are describing there is a cultural superego. There's a cultural inner critic that that especially in youth, and it's actually prevalent in all of us during our adolescence and early 20s, that it's so much about fitting in. Mm-hmm. And that's what you're describing is that you have to be one with the culture. So, I mean, most of the time, if people have enough structure and enough support, they can begin to find who they are in their 30s and to begin to develop that more. But I think that it's true in adolescence and in early 20s, it's all about conforming and becoming immersed in the culture. That's how that feels acceptance.
And we can look at how that's, how will those things that you described do that. But Eric Erickson, the analyst, described, one of his developmental stages was of that age group, the adolescent and the teen in the young 20s, identity versus role diffusion. How do I get that sense of identity of myself? And I'm saying it's easier if we bring in a full spiritual aspect too, but do all the cell phones, all the computers make that role diffusion even more confusing? Our son's 25. He's grown up with a lot of cell phones and textings and computers, and he's managing to emerge from it. But I think it adds each generation has a different challenge in terms of their growth and unfoldment.
Well, I'll tell you, it's always a marvelous conversation to bring up the ideas of how we can become better people, which simply means we can become happier people by loving who we uniquely are, because not everybody is the same. Now, I know that you folks are conducting a workshop on how to integrate compassion and strength and the inner critic. Now, let's talk about the workshop that you conduct there. Is this going to be with several people? How does this all work?
It's the two of us that are leading it, Rod and I, and we're going to see who shows up at Brighton Bush, and usually we have around, anywhere from 8 to 15 people. It kind of depends upon the weekend, and we work with a lot of the skills that we talked about in the show in terms of really learning how to defend against the inner critic, becoming aware of the inner critic, becoming aware of how to make empathic statements towards the child self when we feel that we're being overwhelmed by feelings.
And then we also teach how to own positive and negative projections and, to recognize these old patterns of relationships and how to disengage. And then we have a centering, grounding meditation, so a person has that sense of developing a core sense of themselves, of their identity. And so those 5 practices are taught, and then people have those tools really for the rest of their lives. And Brighton Bush, should be a lovely place to do that. It's, a hot springs resort, so it's a beautiful holding environment or alchemical vessel, for that kind of work. And it's nice, 6, 8, 10 people. There needs to be enough people, so because we have a lot of exercises and dyads and triads in groups of 2s or 3, so people practice the skills. We lecture, we meditate a little, lecture, and then we practice the skills. And that's the most effective way to educate, to really have people practice.
Now let's talk about as you've conducted these workshops and people have been through them, and have you ever had examples of people who might come back to you years later and say, it's just amazing what this has been able to do for me? Do you have like a story or two you can share with our audience?
I just got a letter from a woman who took some of the workshops and had seen me individually to get some support around those practices, and I hadn't seen in 5 or 6 years, and I just got a beautiful letter from her saying how much that had impacted her and changed her life, and how thankful she was for that. And that's after not seeing her for about 6 or 7 years. Yeah. I sort of saved it up there, so when I'm 80, I can read over things like that.
But I made a difference somewhere. I think a lot of us want to feel that way, but making a difference in our own unique ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and
to know that we've had a sense of contribution into the community, one way or the other.
Mhm. Yeah, and that's so important to feel that we have expressed our soul. Really, we've expressed what we've wanted to express. That's what I'm really aware of. Whether people can receive it, everybody's in a different place at a different time, but if I really feel that I'm in alignment with what needs to be expressed through me, that actually is very important to me. My story is that how much I was affected by my teacher who taught me this, and how that totally took me from a place of feeling suicidal in my life to becoming a force to be reckoned with. In other words, I really came out and became much more somebody who came into life, and that was from this work. We've definitely changed it, and we've taken it and made it our own through the years. But that's the one story, as our mentor told us, who we used to study with in Tucson. He said, "Well, I can tell you of all the people I've ever worked with, there's one person who I know has gotten better, and that's me." And so part of what I know and in the work that I do is that when I'm really serious about expressing and working myself, that actually really affects me. And I know that has an effect then on people around me.
And years ago, we were at a workshop with a Nigerian drummer, Babatunde Olatunji, at Esalen. And, he'd always start out his workshops, I think I went to 2 or 3, with, how can I be of service to my fellow man? How can I be of value? And each one of us has a unique blueprint in our soul of who we are and how we're to express that. And it may be, any comparison is superego activity, so we don't want to compare, because it could be, my job is to, caretake the land, or to raise this child, or is to be the head of this company, or is to make this invention, or is to be a bank teller at this window. But each person has a unique expression of their life force and their life potential, a soul dream. And as sort of the inner critic gets cleared away and the child calms down, we get more and more in touch with that soul dream. And that's what each one of us then contribute to our communities and what each one of us contribute to the world. And if we get the superego out of the way and we start to recognize how we are contributing, we'd all be a lot happier.
Now, I think if Sigmund Freud hadn't come up with that term in the first place, we wouldn't know what it is.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I'll tell you, it's been a real pleasure to have both of you on the program here. Do you have a website people can find out more about your workshops and where you're conducting them, what you're doing? Can you do this kind of work by phone if people find an interest in pursuing it?
Yes,
tell us how this all works.
We do Skype sessions, so we can do. I see people in Washington and Northern Oregon, down in Arizona, Alaska, all different places. So you can do that by Skype. And our website is selfsoulcenter.org.
Selfsoulcenter.org. Very good. Well, Dr. Rod Burney, Susanna Nadler, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program. I feel better already, almost integrated.
It's been a pleasure and a delight.
Yeah, it has.
Thank you so much.
You bet. You too. Take care. Thank you very much for being on the program today.
Right.
Thank you.
So there's your opportunity. Also visit us at our website at beyond50radio.com. On our blog, you'll find where we have these shows definitely archived for your listening convenience. It's a matter of integrating the whole of who you are. Don't try to compare yourself to the Joneses, but if you do, give yourself some compassion and a pat on the back just for doing so in the first place. And most importantly, wherever you are right now is where you should be, and that you can always step forward from there. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. You've been listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. Remember, live your day past halfway.